Thank you so much, Amrita, and welcome, Ravindra. So delighted to have you here.
Thank you.
It's been a pleasure reading your book and going through the background of what the book is about and also the content itself. But I'd like you first to tell our audience as to what prompted you to write this book.
Yes, so the book, I would say, it germinated through the research I did on my late grandfather's military career. He sadly passed away in 1995, but I was old enough to and fortunate enough to hear some stories from his career in the British Indian Army during the Second World War. When he fought in the Middle East as part of PI Force, which is Persia and Iran Force, between 41 till 44. And he was in the British Indian Army for close to 7 years. I was doing some research on his military service, and I hit a dead end after after doing a little bit of background research on the battalion that he was in, and the regiment that he was in. But at the same time, I discovered a lot of other material. And then one thing led to another, and over sort of 10-year period, I continued to read and educate myself on the subject. And then somewhere around, I think, 2016 or 17, I decided that it could be the subject of an extensive text, yeah, that's how the book came about.
Thank you. As I was going through the book, of course, there are a lot of instances and a lot of stories that are very sort of revealing. But the one story that really caught my attention, and I felt that it also gave its name to the book, like many other things, is the story of Sitaram. And I wanted you to share that story with our audience today.
Yes, so Sitaram, Subhadar Sitaram, is a very fascinating character. And I draw extensively on his life, and from the autobiography that he left. He wrote, and just to qualify it in the beginning, I think there's been some doubt whether it's an authentic text, because it was written in 1860s in Awadhi, and then translated by his British officer into English. And it used to be a standard text for most of the officers British army officers who came out to India during late 19th and early 20th century, to give an insight into the mind of an Indian soldier. Now, definitely, I think during the translation, it's difficult to maintain the integrity wholly. And I do come across some parts, some paragraphs, and some ideas within the book that could have been embellished by the British officer. But given the depth of cultural references, and just the narrative of the story, the experiences are too authentic to be ignored, and to say that it's not an authentic account. The original has not been discovered, so we only have a translation. But I've come to take it as a reasonably truthful, accurate account left by Subhadar Sitaram Pandey. So coming back to his life, he joined British Indian Army in early 19th century, and he fought in almost all the significant campaigns of the early 19th century, starting with the last. He was briefly in the campaign against Gurkhas, then the last Anglo-Maratha War. And thereafter, he was part of the army that attacked Bharatpur and stormed the Bharatpur fort in 1826. And thereafter, he was part of the army that went to Afghanistan to install Shah Suja on the Kabul throne. He was taken prisoner, sadly, at the end of that disastrous expedition. And through his own hard work and his courage, he managed to secure his freedom, came back to India, Then he participated in the wars against Sikhs in Punjab, and even in the mutiny, he stayed loyal. But his son, and there's a very moving part in the story where his son actually was part of the rebels. And he retired as a Subadar, which is the senior most rank possible for an Indian in the East India Company Army at the time, and even in the British Crown Army after 1857, 1858 onwards. So his life is just a fascinating life, and it's not just about military campaign. He lets himself be seen as an individual, as an Indian, as a product of his time. And he talks about his early relationships. Firstly, the most important one with his parents, his mother specifically, who, like all mothers, was horrified when she discovered that Sitaram wanted to be a soldier. The profession of a soldier in India in 19th century, late 18th century, was a very dangerous one. It was a highly militarized society as the Mughal state collapsed and its remnants kind of maneuvered for predominance. So he narrates those personal relationships, his very nicely, put it this way. He also talks about his love life. There's a beautiful story that he rescues a girl who was kidnapped by an Arab soldier in the army, in the Maratha army in the last Anglo-Maratha war, and he obviously is part of the East India Company's army. And one day his battalion storms a village called Ahanpura, and there, when he enters one of the houses, he sees this Arab basically trying to kill that girl because he thought that there's no chance left of his survival, and he just wanted to run away possibly, and before that he wanted to kill her. Sitaram Pandey, just in the neck of time, he reaches there and he sees what was happening. And the Arab turns around and he says, "Don't interfere, not yet," and attacks Sitaram Pandey with his sword. But in the meantime, Sitaram, takes his rifle and fires at him and kills him. But he receives a serious wound on himself. The girl, helpless as she was, had been taken away from a Rajput family in Bundelkhand, and she basically throws herself at his feet and asks him to protect her. And then, at the great cost of inviting displeasure, both from his uncle, his mama, who was part of the same battalion, and his officer, who did not want a young girl, to be part of the battalion, he still kept her as in the camp followers. There used to be followers who would follow the camp with supplies, etc. He keeps her in the camp as part of the followers of his battalion, and eventually he marries her, and he has a son who sadly during the mutiny was executed. And here, Sitaram sadly finds himself at one stage discovering that his son is about to be executed, and he was to command the firing party. So obviously he breaks down and excuses himself. So I can go on and on, but I think that just should give a good view of what this man is, and why I drew extensively on his life in my book.
It's a fascinating story. But you mentioned that he rose to the level of Subedar, and that was the highest position that the Indians could take. The Indian, the senior most Indian was junior to the junior most British who joined. So there was a great disparity in the forces, in the amount, in their stature, in the amount that they were paid, in the facilities that they were given, in the food that they were given, in the the care that the British Army took of its Indian soldiers. So, what was the reason that made all these guys still continue to sort of believe and trust and rely and continue working for generations almost for the British Army?
Sure. So first, I would just add a minor explanation that the Indian Army, both under the company and under the Crown, had this unique rank of quote unquote Indian officers, which were later on called Viceroy's commissioned officers, which did not exist in any other army. So normally you would have the men in the ranks, and then you would have non-commissioned officer, and then you would have commissioned officers. These Indian officers, quote unquote officers, they were slightly above the non-commissioned officer in any other army, but they were not commissioned officer in the sense that they would not command more than a platoon in the later part of the army, and they would be subordinated to the commissioned officers, and commissioned officers could only be white Europeans from Britain. So they were subordinated, even if you became and to achieve the rank of Subedar, you would be almost in your 50s, very close to the retirement. You had to work that long. Whereas a lieutenant who just joins the British Indian Army on a commissioned rank, probably in his, at least during the company army, late teens, but even later, it could be early 20s. So that commissioned officer would be senior to Subedar rank. So that was this, and this unique rank existed only in the Indian battalions, not in the British battalions. In the British battalions, they had the standard European battalions. I mean, in India, they had the standard men in rank, and then the non-commissioned officers and the commissioned officers. So your question is, why did they come to serve despite such severe discrimination? And it's a very complex, actually, it's not possible to answer even in half an hour. There are various strands, and that's why the book exists. If you would ask me to draw upon few important critical factors, I would say that the most important is that the command and control military command and control structure in India had broken down at that time in the 18th century. And it was a period of great flux. It was a period of great opportunity. But equally, it was a period of desperation as well. India has been a highly militarized society from ancient times, and as the Mughal state started collapsing because of the fundamentalist policies of the last significant emperor, it led to the destruction of that military command and control structure, which led to a lot of unemployed soldiers across the realm. So that is one part of it, that you had this structure that is collapsing. And the second part is that to be fair to the European employers, either European traders who started hiring these Indian soldiers, French were one of the first ones, actually, not the English company started a little bit later, but including English company as well. They were very regular in their payments. So although the payment was not very high, they would pay their soldiers regularly. And very soon they see something which is almost like a, which worked so well for them, which is the pension system. So one senior British Army official actually says that the pension is a great hold on India in a parliamentary committee meeting in London in 1850s. So there were these minor adjustments in terms of how the employment terms of the soldiers were structured, which made soldiers more or less stay loyal to the new employer despite all these structural inequalities. At the same time, they came loose, so to speak, in the first place because of this civil war, disorganization, and the chaos that was running around in India simultaneously. But equally importantly, I think one chapter deals with it in great depth, which is the chapter is itself titled "Food to the Salt." That the culture of soldiery in India had been based on very deep and meaningful, significant values that the profession of soldiery in India centered itself around for centuries, for millennia. And soldiers continued that, and I'm not saying that every single soldier was upheld that value system. Obviously, there were renegades, and there were people who was fell far short of those ideals. But this normative paradigm that existed underlying the profession of a soldier is something that was quite unique to India, very dissimilar to Britain, to Europe in general, I would say. There are some comparisons with with Japan. Their culture, their martial culture, especially the samurai, and other Asian military societies. So a combination of all of these. You'll have to read the book, but that's how they came to be employed by these European trading companies. And once these trading companies started to succeed, then success had its own momentum. And they managed to demilitarize a significant part of India by early 19th century, certainly after the last Anglo-Maratha War. And once the society had been demilitarized, the people who valued the profession of arms and who would not do other things. And that's one of the sort of fallouts of a regimental, structured, unequal society that sadly India was and is, that people would rather be, soldiers, if that is what they've been used to doing, than to move into professions. Not that there were many other highly mobile professions available to them by the time 19th century came, but their preference would still be to stick to the soldiery, to maintain their status as a soldier in South Asia. So a combination of those factors led them to stay. And once you are part of a bigger exploitative system, which any imperial hierarchy is, it's a bit too late to realize which side you ended up in, and 2-3 generations go by, and then it's very difficult to actually change it. So then it also becomes, India increasingly became a less mobile, less less economically productive, in the sense that there were not many economic opportunities. It became a poorer society as well compared to Europe and rest of the world throughout 19th century. And there, obviously, it's an economic choice as well. When there aren't many other professions and there is not such high mobility and economic opportunity, but that is not the sole all of it. It's far more complex, and hopefully your listeners would actually read the book and learn about it.
Thank you. And actually, it's wonderful that this spirit of this loyalty and this sort of commitment to your army. At least today we are very glad that it continues in the free India, and forces inspire so much loyalty and conviction and courage that I'm for one very glad for that. You mentioned a little bit about the political scene in India being what it was. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? Because that was also, contributing a lot to why there were so many people from, who joined the forces for the British rather than for the Indian Princeton states and so on.
Yeah. So as I said, the 18th century was a century of utter disruption. I have categorized it as civil war, and the civil war, in my view, started pretty much by end of 17th century, as Aurangzeb pursued those fundamentalist policies, the unique thing is that the opposition to his rule came from people who were not part of the structure. So Marathas in the south, and Jats in north, and Sikhs in what is Punjab. Primarily, there were others as well, but I'm talking about the ones who continued to oppose and eat away at the foundations of the military structure consistently, year after year, generations after generations. You suddenly have a situation where these rank outsiders who were not supposed to be part of the military elite, or were not supposed to be part of ruling elite, start eating at the foundations of this great military edifice. People forget that in India, under Mughal rule, was a massive military fiscal enterprise. You almost had about 1 million men under Aurangzeb. Now, some of them might be camp followers and false musters and so on and so forth. But an army of that size is incomparable, in the world during peace times. And I would say that has continued to be the case till about 20th century, when China and India actually had such significantly large armies outside of great wars. So you have that situation where this tussle for the legitimacy of the central authority starts because of the opposition of rank outsiders, and then when the core the strategic hegemony of the core Mughal state is not able to destroy them, you eventually, by the middle of 18th century, what you have is that the various remnant surviving parts of the Mughal structure, which is essentially two or three, the Nizam in Hyderabad, the Awadh dynasty, the Wazir in Awadh, and the Bengal Nawab. These were the sort of three main that were left in terms of the old Mughal regime. They started to act independently as well. So previously, at least, they were all united around the house of Mughal house, around the house of Timur. But when they saw that the order and discipline in the empire, military discipline, was not enforced, not maintained, and these other opposing powers, which is, the Maratha, Jat, Sikhs, have actually taken the boldness and taken the liberty to actually destroy significant part of the authority of Mughals in these regions. These remaining part also started to behave independently. But it is in that situation, you obviously have the civil war where various parties are trying to overpower each other. And you have these trading companies which had been in India since 1600, and some even earlier. Portuguese have been there even earlier. They see an opportunity. They did see an opportunity actually even in the 17th century. Both Bernier, Manucci, and many other observers who travel in India, they actually account that if there were a couple of trained regiments of Europeans, you could actually take this country. Now, how far that is true and how far that is mere boast is a different matter. But the strategic weakness of the Mughal Empire was commented upon from late 17th century onwards by foreign visitors. So these traders, they start hiring soldiers, and in that, in some sense, they were helped because the soldiers in the Mughal state and in other local polities, they were not particularly treated, as well as they ought to be, in the sense that their pay would be withheld for a couple of months a year, and that would be just to make sure that they don't defect. Eventually it did not even achieve that objective, so they defected as well, and destroyed states and kingdoms in the process. But this is where there was some key elements where the foreign trading companies, because they had almost no literal military ground in India, they had to act in a manner which was institutionalized. And in that, they were also helped because they were not dependent on few men, few princes who ran these companies. These were run by officers who were sent by Britain, France, and Netherlands. So if you had a Clive and a Monroe, and very talented and very successful, then that's brilliant. You benefit from it. But if suddenly Clive disappears from the scene, it's not like the same as I don't know. Let's say Raja Shivaji is not around anymore. So you have such significant crisis that emerge from dynastic kingdoms. You just have another officer who's sent from England or Netherlands or France, and the policies continue, the contracts still continue. So this company structure provided them a degree of elasticity and a degree of stability more than anything, when everything else in India at that time was unstable. And the life chances and the family circumstance of a soldier, if they're dealing with a counterparty that is stable, that is consistent and fair in its payment. I mean, not fair, you could not say it is fair because they had great disparity, but at least consistent and reliable, meant that they continued to give a good account of themselves in their service. So, I mean, it's a very rounded way. Again, book covers all these themes in sort of different chapters. But it is that there are no simple stories of why somebody does this and somebody does that. The another key element is that India was and continues to be a highly diverse society. When you talk about diversity, there's no comparison to the diversity that existed in India, that exists in India today, with the European nation states of 18th century and 17th, 18th centuries. From time immemorial, you have soldiers who fight for their masters, from sort of, and used to seeing people from all sorts of different backgrounds. So you have European traders trading in India from Portuguese and others. You have these foreigners from Central Asia, who implanted themselves as part of the Mughal state. And then you have the Afghans who were in and out before the Mughals, and even after Mughals, they tried to come and stay there. So India was a very diverse, complicated, diverse, structured in a way, but very, how should I say, diverse in another way. And people were just not used to identifying people straight away as foreigners, and that's why being with them is going to be treacherous and not foreigners, and it's going to be okay. That strong degree of distinction that existed between a Protestant German and a Catholic French, and so on and so forth, is not as strong in India, because the degree of diversity that people were used to. But what was core to this soldier-master relationship in India was the understanding of lack of interference in the soldier's faith, and giving him the liberty to actually practice the faith that he or she professed, he professed by his master, and that underlined that their unwritten contract. And as long as that contract was maintained, soldiers served their masters well, irrespective of their background. So that in some way helped these trading companies to hire these soldiers, because they've been around for 100, 150 years. These are not suddenly English, Dutch, French in the 18th century. Are suddenly, they're not unheard of. They're not unknown. They were there as medicine men. They were there as traders. The biggest employment outside their own trading companies, as part of the local princes' structures, was where they were actually doctors to Mughal kings and emperors and their families, and so on and so forth. So these are people that Indians were very used to, very familiar with, seeing and trying and working with them. Whereas if you I don't know, in today, in a small village in Europe, in Germany, if you land up an Indian or an African, it'll stand out, and that sort of the kind of response even in this age and century is very stern, severe, and contrasting because of lack of people's experience. That's not the case of Indians in 18th century. So although they were endogamous in their own tribes, castes, religious groups, but they were used to seeing a very high degree of diversity in the sort of economics, political, and military sphere. And diversity, I mean, it might be politically incorrect to say it, but diversity and strategic stability has, if you look at the evidence, that they haven't gone well in past as part of non-democratic state structures. Whether it is compatible in democratic states is a different matter, and I think the evidence there is that yes, it is. But in non-democratic states, having such high degree of diversity and strategic stability is not been proven to be compatible. And you can look at the Ottoman example, and how they had issues with their minorities and so on and so forth, and various other states in Europe. So it was fundamentally, Mughal state was an unstable. Its foundations were unstable because of the difference between this sort of focus of the ruling elite and the rest of the country, at least in the religious beliefs. And sooner or later, it came to that. Because if you think about it, the European trading entities were there in Ottoman Empire. They were there in the Persian Empire, and they traded well. But their impact was limited to actually trading. They never had an opportunity to be able to influence the state policies, although in terms of their economic reach and strength, both of them were inferior to the Mughal Empire in terms of the overall size of the economy and everything else. They were not as big as Mughal state, but both of them had a core of a ruling elite that was homogeneous, centered around one faith, not so much ethnicity, but at least one faith, language, which was the core, how should I say, legitimizing principle of the state organization before democracies took hold in late 19th and 20th century. So that's a long-winded answer to your question, I'm afraid, but there's more in the book.
Yeah. So, you know, how how were the Indians rewarded for this loyalty that they showed? Now, you have a wonderful example that you bring out from the contemporary times of how in Afghanistan, the soldier, the American army just or the Western armies just left, walked away one day, and what happened to the people. Did the Indian soldiers get some treatment like that? I know you talk a little bit about it in the book, so can you share that with us?
Yes. So, when I was looking at the videos of these Afghans being left behind to be slaughtered by Taliban when Americans and NATO decided to leave, and at the same time, you see a huge amount of moral outrage on social media from European populations. But I'd been doing this research for a long time, and I've been writing at the same time. And to me, it's this moral outrage is kind of a hogwash, because it's nothing new. Somehow people, because they're not taught, they don't understand, they're not taught history outside their own countries, they think that this is something unique that has happened. But at the end of the day, imperialists are nobody's friends, and especially empires which have a very segregated discriminatory policy between the metropolitan areas and the peripheral areas, which Britain had. So in that sense, it's different even from the Mughal Empire or any other empire. At least there you had a stronger degree of connection between the center and its peripheries. Here, the center is in London, and the majority of the periphery is in India. And they had very little sympathy, at least in terms of evidence that you read, because if we had sympathy, we would not do things like that. So what did they do? They sent this army to put Shah Shuja on the throne of Afghanistan. And obviously the army had to be, East India Company's army. Majority of, well, almost 95% of that was Indian. Previously in 16th, 17th, even up to 18th century, the Indian army always marched with their families. Mughal army especially, the families, the women and children would follow as followers as part of the larger army. Now, Raja Shivaji obviously had changed that, and that's why he had such successes. And in many senses, his success is also the success of sound military policy that he adopted for the time that he was on the scene, which was not very long, sadly. But bearing that period, you have again in the Peshwa times the armies being followed by the families and everything. So those kind of things. But when East India Company started recruiting its army in India, they strictly enforced that the families would not march with soldiers, except for the Madras army. So in Madras army, you still had the practice in early part of 18th century, early part of 19th century, where the wife and children, not long, big, extensive family, but at least the wife and children would be allowed to follow the soldier as part of the march. But everywhere else it was stopped. Certainly in the Bengal army, it was not the case. But when going to Afghanistan, they allowed all the Indian soldiers to bring their wives and their children with them. But at the same time, they prohibited the European soldiers, of which there were not many, about 2,000 or so, 2,000 to 2,500, to not bring their wives and children for safety reasons. Now, how is it fair that if it's not sensible, if it's not safe to bring Europeans to bring their wives and children to Afghanistan, how would it be safe for Indians? But clearly they did not care. Their logic was that if they did bring their families, they would feel more at home in Afghanistan and less likely to rebel or wanted to come back or feel homesick. And by that logic, they allowed almost 40,000 followers as part of this army. So many of which obviously were the supply people and others, but they were good. There must have been at least 20,000 or so, more than 20,000 or so family members. So that that in itself shows how little they valued Indian lives, or the lives of the people who were closest to them, which is the soldiers. By the way, the closest encounter of British during the 19th century with Indians was with the soldiers, because that's where the officers and the men interacted in very difficult circumstances, and when you're dealing with matters of life and death, you are able to interact and come in close contact with people at a level which is not possible in society otherwise. And to those people, they allowed their family to be endangered such. And eventually, it did turn out that when Afghans started to basically come down hard on this army, some of it which was actually sent back to India earlier before time, and when they started to retreat from Afghanistan, there were about 15,000 followers, family members, women and children, almost all Indians, and about 4,000 fighting men, of which I would say about 800 probably, or at the max 1,000 Europeans, but the rest 3,000 Indian soldiers. They were all slaughtered to last woman, last child, and last soldier. That's just a sad commentary on. I mean, armies do get defeated, but this is a very sad commentary on how not just the army, but it's the family members, how they were treated. And that does not escape the notice of soldiers, because all the regiments that were in Afghanistan during this disaster, they all mutinied in 1857. So the roots of that mutiny, in many sense, could be traced back to this disastrous campaign, at least from the Bengal soldiers' mind.
So how did so obviously this news was of what was happening in the wars was by that time carried back to the native countries and so on. How did the local Britishers respond to this? Has there been any sense of remorse that they let this? What did the local normal people in England feel about this when they read about this?
Yeah, so that's the thing about large empires, where the periphery and the sort of metropolis are at such big distance, figuratively, literally, and emotionally. So yes, there is a lot of soul searching about how this defeat occurred, the disaster, but it's all in the strategic terms. It's all about how we lost out in this great game against Russia, quote unquote Russia. How it does lead to a lot of heads rolling, the governor general changes, and so on and so forth. The army officers also change. But it's when the analysis, when the sort of review of what has happened is being done, nobody sheds tears about Indian women and children dying in Afghanistan, or being reduced to cannibalism, sadly, which Lady Sale, whose account I have relied on primarily, does testify to. So sadly, there isn't much tear that is being shed on part of British population back home. Some newspapers in India do actually mention that there were unwise decisions, especially allowing the families to accompany these Indian soldiers was unwise. But the whole, even today, when you hear about, there are some historians who have covered Afghan campaign. Very interesting books have come out in last 15 years as well. But when I read those books, I can't relate the event to what they're writing in, although they are very interesting books. But the real story of Afghan campaign is the suffering of the Indian women and children. Leave aside soldiers, the Indian women and children who were part of these soldiers' families. Everything else is subtext. What the sort of Afghan kings and their adversaries did, what Russians were doing, what few British officers were doing. When you look at and think about history, you got to think about what's happening, which has such a big impact on maximum number of people. And that while the event is happening, i.e., while their death occurred, and subsequently in dislodging the loyalty of these soldiers to the East India Company, which led to 1857 and so on and so forth. That is this main text. Everything else is subtext. And in those narratives, in those books, all you read about is how this, great great game against Russia, and how a couple of English officers, Burns and this and that, were trying to establish themselves, and how they suffered, and McNaughton got killed and all of that. Okay, that is a fact, but 600, 700 people dying against whole families being slaughtered en masse is basically putting your lens in an area which is to me, as an Indian at least, is a sideshow.
So, but this is not just now, right? You also mentioned about articles and paintings that were done in England in a few years after the war, where there is no reflection and no show of any Indian soldiers having participated in the war at all. The Last Stand.
Right. Yeah, so I think you're referring to, so there's a very famous painting called Last Stand at Gundam. It was painted actually almost 50 years after the event, probably more. That painting has, in the sort of military strategic British folklore, has come to represent the stoic, the courage of British soldiery, and uprightness, and so on and so forth. And the painting is funny because the painter, when he's painting it woolen, he's actually, the Afghans look like Mahdis in Egypt or Sudan, because of the wars that were happening in 1880s and 1890s in that part of the world, and probably there were depictions and quite possibly photos from there. So instead of the Afghans look like Sudanese Egyptians. There is no Indian soldier, and forget about families, which actually were trying to save themselves, about 300, 400 of them, desperately begging these English soldiers to at least provide some protection, because it was their job. And all you have is these, these men of 44th Essex Regiment, supposedly making a last stand. So, when you read the whole story, the 44th was the vanguard, which was supposed to defend this caravan, this camp of 15,000 civilians and the 4,000 fighting men. They were supposed to be defending these people and bringing them safely out of Afghanistan. What happens is that within a day or two, when they see that the intention of Afghans is not to let anybody out, their intention primarily is to take as many Europeans as prisoners, because Muhammad Khan's father was still a prisoner of EIC in Calcutta, and he knew that the more English he had in his prisons, better the chances of his father being released and reaching terms that were more suitable to him and his family. So, and they also knew that they don't give much value to Indian lives. So he refused to take Indians prisoners. He just, asked them to be slaughtered or taken as slaves and sold in Central Asia or in Afghanistan. That is the sad reality of this campaign. And I forgot the question that you asked.
That's fine. What I was, I'm going to now let people ask their questions after my last question to you, and I'm going to give this time to people to put their questions in the chat box. And this is, if you can throw a little light about, if people were not saved and if they were taken as prisoners of war, the Indian soldiers, tell us a little bit about their lives. And meanwhile, my request to everyone in the audience, if you have any questions for Ravindra, please put them in the chat box and I'll ask them those questions.
Yeah, so I mean, that actually is more a question of those who take them as prisoner of war. So I guess you're referring to the First World War, where a large garrison of British Indian Army surrendered to Ottomans in 1916 at Kota Lamara. They obviously, had a very harrowing treatment at the hands of their captors. And in a sense, both the Europeans, i.e. the English and Indians, were treated as badly. So sadly, it's the knife of an enemy that brings about this sad, tragic even-handedness in their treatment, which they do not manage to achieve in better circumstances as part of a combined army. So that I'll stop at that. A lot of details in my book. I'm happy to take question, I guess,
Okay, so Riyadh has a question. What was the role of the British Army in the independence movement?
So I, well, firstly, the counter, well, independence, the counter of independence is occupation. So if you're not independent, you're occupied. And the first role of the British Indian Army is they were central to this occupation of the country. So it's a multi-layered, complex story. So British held India by obviously by the divisions that existed, and the fact that Indians could not provide an alternative to Mughal state, which was the sustainable government structures. The entities could not, fight to finish. One of the party could not fight to finish the other one, so that they could overtake. So there was that situation, and government is central to. Government is one of the essence, one of the central services that you require for human existence. If there's no government, there's chaos. So East India Company did provide a government, but it provided the most expensive government that is ever possible in the world. The highest level of taxes, lowest level of services, almost all of it spent on the defense, because you had to keep the country occupied. And the country was occupied by the British Indian Army. So British Indian Army was central to the occupation of India. And by corollary, it was also had to be central to the independence of India. So if the British imperial structure could not rely on the British Indian Army to control India, it would collapse and it would leave immediately. And the imperial officers, both in London and in India, were very clear about it, that the only way the Raj sustains in India is through the British Indian Army. And the day when we don't control this army, we would not be able to rule this country at all. And that transition, where they previously so wholeheartedly relied on this army, absolutely relied and controlled this army, not just relied, but controlled. So it goes hand in hand. They had instruments through which they controlled the army, and they were successful till about 1939. And during the Second World War, sadly, they lost, well, sadly for them and not so sad for Indians probably, they lost control of that British Indian Army. And that happened through a number of mechanisms. The key element was that a large number of educated middle class Indians had to be hired as commissioned officers during the Second World War. So, but as a comparison, you only had about 300 Indian commissioned officers at the start of the Second World War. By end of the Second World War, you had about 15,000 Indian commissioned officers, and all willing to stay in the army and make a long-term career out of it. Not conscripts that they had, doctors and teachers from England and Australia that they drafted in. So you had an army which certainly had Indian officers who fought against Japanese and Germans, who had field experience. And that is not the army of peasant soldiers from Punjab that you managed to control before the war, because their worldview is limited, and what they thought about the world and how they interacted with the authority, imperial authority, was totally different. They worked in the old paradigm of a loyal soldier master relationship, where these people were educated professionals with their sympathies towards their countrymen to great extent. And obviously the massive change in popular thinking, both within the country and in the army, was brought about by INA trials. So when the trials started, when people started to learn more and more about what these soldiers did, the sympathy of the army overwhelmingly was in support of the INA officers and soldiers who were being tried. This came, frankly, it came as a shock to the senior British officers, because there was if they were not expecting it. That's why they started these trials in the first place at the Red Fort. They did not think that the army would react like this, having fought with these people, having defeated them on the field of battle, that the opinion and the sympathies of Indian soldiers and officers would overnight overwhelmingly shift in favor of them, or at least in favor of not punishing them with capital sentences, which was the only sentence that you could give somebody who's taken weapon against an established government. Anything less than that means that you're delegitimizing your own government and letting multiple rebellions spread. So yeah, that's covered in my book, and that's why British Indian Army was absolutely central to the country's occupation for almost a century and a half, and British Indian Army by corollary was also absolutely central to India's independence, and that's why it came so quickly at the end of the Second World War, while Britain had no desire to let go of its empire. You have the example of Kenya during 50s and Malaysia and elsewhere. Forget about that. In 2014, if there was a survey that said, it'll be majority of people said it'll be good to have an empire. And and that's 2014, not 1946 or 47. So I'll stop at that, I guess.
So Revati says that connecting the Afghan campaign to the 1857 War of Independence throws a whole new light. And of course, there's every time we have a talk like this, there is a debate on the usage of the term mutiny as against the First War of Indian Independence that Chandrika has pointed out. Her question also is, why did the Indian Army remain loyal during the Second World War? If they had rebelled, would India have gotten independence sooner?
Yeah, so during the Second World War, it is right that majority of the Indians who were part of the British Indian Army were actually loyal to the British rule. A large number, the INA was a very small number compared to the overall number of the British Indian Army, which is almost 2.5 million. And in INA, you had about 50,000 roundabout. Many of them volunteers, Tamils from Southeast Asia, and the rest being the Punjabi soldiers which were captured. I mean, that was the, again, it goes back to the same thing. In 1939, Army was not the same as it was in 1946. In 1939, Army was still the army of predominantly illiterate peasant soldiers from Punjab, with an exception of a sprinkling of about 300 commissioned officers in the quote-unquote Indianizing units, which were basically ghetto units, where Indians were allowed to be officers over Indians, so that they don't have a European or a white man does not have to take order from an Indian. And at that speed, it would have taken another 100 years to Indianize the whole army. And that was the scheme. And that's why in 1930s, they inaugurated a new capital in Delhi. You don't inaugurate a new city as the capital to leave it 15 years later in rush. So that was the scheme of things. That was the existing structure of the army, because their instruments of control over the Indian army had worked very well. And the most important of all of them was, in fact, that you do not allow them to achieve commissioned officer positions, because with commissioned officer, you have the ability to command on the field larger units. And they did not allow that to happen. And the second element about the differences in the weapons that Indian soldiers were allowed to possess compared to the European soldiers in India, that was another key way in which they kept the parity between Indian and European soldiers in India, because the number of Indian soldiers was always higher. Before 1857, it was almost 4 to 5 times of European soldiers. After that, it was aimed to be no more than 2, but it always remained more because there were not enough European soldiers that could be sent to India. But they were always given better weapons, and once they got once the degree of advancement of weapon moved for a European soldier, the previous version was given to Indian, and that, I think, that did change, I think, around about by the end of the First World War. But artillery again stayed firmly in the control of Europeans in India. Except for the mountain battery on the mules, which was used against Afghanistan, against the frontier wars in Afghanistan. So a combination, and the most important, obviously, was exploiting the differences, the religious caste differences between the various communities within India, and also using army as an instrument of state largesse appeasement. By concentrating the recruitment ground in Punjab, what it allowed the government to do was to then provide a lot of facilities within Punjab, the new canal colonies and so on and so forth, so that people feel that there is benefit, that this government is actually a benign government. which, by the way, was not the experience of the rest of the country, certainly not of the Bihar and Eastern UP, the original recruitment ground of the Bengal Army, which rebelled in 1857. So these were strategies that worked by limiting the recruitment ground for the army from a particular area, spending more there compared to rest of the country, not spending massively like Britain, but still, you're spending quite a lot so that people feel the benign hand of the government, not letting them control heavy artillery, and but most importantly, enjoying their sort of dividing them on various distinctions so that one unit can be used against another, but not letting them become army officers. So that thing changed, and the last one specifically changed between 39 to 46. And that's why you had a different army before the war and a different army after the war. And no English officer in his right mind could see that army in the same light, where you're literally talking to people who talk in same language, same idiom. They go and want to have a beer in the army mess and stuff like that. So these are kind of very different. That whole imperial racial structure suddenly turned upside down on its head. And that is important in army, because in civil services, you had Surendranath Sen becoming an ICS officer 1864. So that was permitted. And in legislation, you had the provincial legislations, and throughout in 35, 37, you had the elections of all the provinces. So Indians were allowed to come to a very senior level, both in the civil services and legislature, but not in army. In army, the demand started at the beginning of 20th century, almost from 1900 onwards, but they did not let that happen because they knew Indians becoming officers or Indians becoming in control of significant part of the army means that Europeans cannot control this country, control this army, and as a consequence, this country anymore.
Commander Mohan asks, why were the INA soldiers not reinstated into the independent India's army, even though they were promised by the Indian political leaders during the INA trials?
I can't answer that, unfortunately. I can only surmise. I mean, it's difficult to. I mean, so it is government's decision at that time. It is an unfortunate and sad decision, because these people clearly, fought for the cause that they ultimately believed in was the right one, which is the independence of their own country. So it is sad. Military discipline is one reason that's given, but Pakistan managed to maintain military discipline within lower ranks, and despite him incorporating these soldiers in their ranks. So it is not that by incorporating this small number, it was not a huge number, by the way, the ones who were repatriated to India, many of them actually died, and that's actually one point that people forget. More Indian soldiers died fighting against Britain in the Second World War than those who died fighting for the British in the Second World War. So although the total number of soldiers might have been 2.5 million under British Indian Army, which was on the side of British, and those who were against them were only about 50,000, but those who were against them gave an account of their motivation by their death. And the death figures of INA are higher than even the Russian army's death figure. They are as close as the German, Russian, 30, almost 40% or 50% of the INA soldiers died on the field. And that's nowhere compared to the American death figures, which is in low single digits, American Army and British Army's death figures, which is in low single digits as well. So, you can make that comparison. Yeah.
DJ Murthy says, you said the Sepoy to Subedar was a recommended read for British officers during joining the Indian Army, but the book was only published in 1970. I don't know whether there's an earlier edition that you want to talk about.
Which one are we talking about?
Sepoy to Subedar.
Oh no, so Sepoy to Subedar I think is out of print right now, but I mean I managed to find an old version on Amazon. I don't know whether it's actually, under print rights from any publisher, but
No,
it had been.
uh, was it a recommended read for the British officers joining the Indian Army?
Correct, correct.
Okay.
So the British officers, before they came over to India, this was one of the books that was part of their curriculum. Obviously, after its publication, but it couldn't have been before. But from 1870s onwards, so whenever it was published, it was part of the curriculum for the British Army officers in India. That's claimed in the book itself, in the preface written by one of the British Army officers.
Myresh Gangal says, thank you for an incredible talk. Were British Indian Army treated differently compared to our army battalions from other British colonies? I thought there were no other army battalions from other British colonies, or were there?
No, there were. But they were more. They came much later. Their numbers were smaller, and many of them were hired actually during the Second World War. So you had the West African battalions and even Caribbean. Some soldiers were hired from there, but that's incomparable to. So Indian Army was the half of the British Army for 2 centuries. So the almost 50% of the soldiers that were under the British standard globally were stationed in India. And that continued for year after year after year after year for 200 years. Whereas in Africa, primarily the recruitment drive and the numbers that were hired went up during the great conflicts, especially during the Second World War. So there's no comparison. I mean, India was central to this military fiscal enterprise of British Empire. And there is no number that comes anywhere close, both in terms of the period through which it lasted and the numbers that were involved in the first place in terms of standing number of soldiers.
A last question from Myresh, and then we'll wind this down. He says, for people who joined the British Army, did their job help them to think beyond their own caste, or were the British policies designed to keep those barriers as they were?
Oh, that was absolutely the core of the British policy, starting from Robert Clive, who wanted Gentus and Mohammedans to be kept in separate units so that each could keep a check on the other. And that continued all the way till independence. So there was some attempt to combine, to make regiments which would be class company regiments, i.e. you would have some companies, companies about 100 soldiers, 2 or 3 companies from one particular community, and then 2 or 3 from another community, and that's how you build a battalion. But that almost came full circle, and by the beginning of this century, we were again down to single community battalions. So, but even if you wanted class community regiments, they were again based on the same thinking that a whole battalion would not be able to rebel in unison, because it would have people from different communities. So that's absolutely the core. The 3 key instruments is inferior weapons, divisions, exploiting divisions between Indians that existed, and not letting them become officers. Those 3 were the sort of key instruments of control. And the third one only broke down during the Second World War. The first 2 broke down in 1857 as well, because the Hindus, Muslims were broadly united, and they helped themselves to the government armory in Delhi, which was the best depot for arms. But the third one, which is officers who had field experience, who could command an army of 20,000-30,000 soldiers, were deficient. You have the Mughal prince who made a mess of the whole thing, and he was replaced by Bakht Khan, who was the cavalry commander from Meerut, and he again could not keep the soldiers and the army in under discipline. So that is something that could only come back in 1939 onwards. So experienced soldiers are a very precious commodity in some sense for the strategic safety of a country.
On that note, we'll wind down with Revathi's comment. She says her father was a British Indian Navy naval commissioned officer, and she has good memories of those times. So thank you very much. This was a lovely chat, very, very revealing in things that we sometimes either believe that we think we know them, but we actually don't know. And reading books like yours casts sort of a light on some of those hitherto unknown areas. So thank you very much. I hope everyone grabs a copy of the book to read it and enjoy your weekend, folks. Thank you, Ravi.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me. Have a wonderful day. Thank you to all your listeners as well.